In 1957, the United States government locked a 27-year-old prisoner in a room in the basement of a federal penitentiary, injected him with massive doses of LSD 3 times a week for 15 months, and repeatedly asked him one specific question: would you ever be willing to take someone's life? He had never harmed anyone physically at that point. His record was bank robbery and truck hijacking. They never told him what the drug was. They told him he was helping find a cure for schizophrenia. He described the sessions later as living nightmares: blood coming out of the walls, men turning to skeletons in front of him, feeling certain he was losing his mind. The government eventually let him go. No follow-up care, no monitoring, $10 and an open gate. What Boston got back was Whitey Bulger.
And what happened next? Across 60 years, 5 prisons, and one of the most corrupt law enforcement arrangements in American history is a story that makes every mob movie look like a rough draft. Section 1. The Atlanta Breakdown. July 1956. James Bulger walks into the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. He is 26 years old. He has just been handed a 20-year sentence for armed bank robbery. He is physically tough, street smart, and has spent his whole life in the roughest corners of South Boston. By October, 3 months later, he is in the psychiatric ward. That is how fast Atlanta broke him. The facility housed some of the most dangerous federal prisoners in the country at the time, and unlike the individual cells Bulger would later encounter, Atlanta used large group cells that packed multiple men together with no real separation and no privacy. For Bulger, this arrangement was unbearable almost immediately. He wrote a letter to Father Robert Drinan, who was then the dean of Boston College Law School, describing what those first months felt like. He said he could not stand the 8-man cell. He said if any of the men in that cell bothered him one more time, he was not going to hold back. He said his nerves were completely shot. That letter is real. It was obtained and verified by journalist David Boeri and reported through WBUR Boston. It is one of the earliest documented windows into what prison actually did to Bulger. Not the myth, but the man. What the letter reveals is not a hardened criminal casually serving time. It is a young man on the edge of a mental collapse, within weeks of entering the federal system. The psychiatric ward placement was not a manipulation or a stunt to get better conditions. Prison documents from the period, reviewed by reporters Dick Lear and Jerry O'Neill for their biography of Bulger, confirm that he was genuinely destabilized in those early months.
But here is what happened next, and this is where the story gets darker. The Atlanta Penitentiary in the late 1950s was not just a prison. It was also, without the knowledge of most of the people inside it, a testing site. The Central Intelligence Agency had a classified program running at the time called MK Ultra. The program's stated purpose internally was to figure out whether drugs, particularly powerful hallucinogens, could be used to control human behavior, extract information, or break a person's mind entirely. The CIA needed test subjects. Federal prisons gave them access to a population that could not say no without consequences. At Atlanta, prisoners were approached with an offer: participate in a medical research program studying treatments for schizophrenia. Receive reduced time off your sentence in exchange. Bulger heard about the program through word going around the prison hospital ward, where he had been assigned after his psychiatric breakdown.
The deal sounded straightforward. Help science, get out faster.
He agreed. He was 27 years old when the experiments started. The reality of what happened bore no resemblance to what he was told. There was no schizophrenia research. There was no medical benefit being studied. What the program was actually testing was how much LSD a human brain could absorb before it stopped functioning normally. Specifically, they wanted to know what repeated, massive doses of the drug did to a person over a long period of time.
Bulger and the other prisoners in the program were given LSD repeatedly, not once as an experiment, but continuously at high doses multiple times per week for 15 months. He described what those sessions were like in his own words, written decades later. He described hallucinating that blood was coming out of the walls. He described watching other men appear to turn into skeletons in front of him. He described a camera that transformed, in his perception, into the head of a dog. He wrote that he felt certain he was losing his mind. 8 men, locked in a room in the basement of the prison hospital, under the influence of massive amounts of LSD, while men in suits who were not doctors ran tests and asked questions. The sessions ran from 9 in the morning on Tuesday to 9 in the morning on Wednesday, 24 hours at a time. The questions the researchers asked during these sessions are documented. One of them, confirmed through Bulger's own correspondence and later reported by multiple outlets, including Newsweek and PBS, was, "Have you ever taken someone's life?" The other was, "Would you ever take someone's life?" He had never harmed anyone physically at the point these questions were being asked. That is a documented fact. His criminal record to that point involved bank robbery and truck hijacking. No violence. No assault resulting in serious injury on his record. The CIA was asking a man with no history of taking a life, while he was forced into a chemically altered state, whether he would be willing to do it. After the program ended, Bulger described the lasting damage clearly. He wrote that he suffered violent nightmares from that point forward for the rest of his life. He wrote that he woke up screaming. He said he could only sleep with the lights on, and even then only for an hour or two at a time before another nightmare pulled him awake. He wrote these things not once, but repeatedly, in letters to multiple people over many years, and the consistency of his account across all of them is striking. 18 prisoners participated in the Atlanta LSD program. Some of them, according to reporting from the period, never psychologically recovered. At least some took their own lives. Bulger survived. But what walked back into the prison population after 15 months of that program was not the same person who had walked into it. The men in suits packed up their notes and left. The CIA classified the program. And Bulger, still years away from finishing his sentence, stayed inside the prison system with a brain that no longer worked the way it had before they got to it. He was not done with the federal government yet, and the federal government was not done with him. The next chapter begins on a rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay, a place most prisoners spent years desperately trying to escape. Bulger would later say it was the best place he ever lived. Section 2. Life on the Rock. Alcatraz sits in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Cold water on all sides, powerful currents running beneath the surface, and a view of a free city close enough to see, but far enough to be completely out of reach. The federal government chose that location deliberately. The prison that opened there in 1934 was designed as a final destination. The place you went when you had made problems at every other federal facility in the country. Bulger arrived on November 16, 1959. He was 30 years old. His inmate number was 1428-AZ. He had just spent 3 years at Atlanta being chemically altered by a CIA program he had been tricked into joining. His sleep was ruined. His mind had been pushed to places it had not come back from cleanly. And now, he was on an island. But something unexpected happened on that island. Alcatraz, the prison that terrified the American public more than any other, turned out to be the place where Bulger finally exhaled. The first reason was simple: his own cell. Atlanta had put him in an 8-man cell. The overcrowding, the lack of privacy, the inability to get away from other people, that environment had driven him to a psychiatric breakdown within his first 3 months. Alcatraz gave every inmate a 5-foot by 9-foot cell with a door. Alone. That sounds like deprivation.
For Bulger, it was relief. His first cell was C-145, along the main corridor the inmates called Broadway. He was moved later to the top tier of C Block, to cell C-314. That upper tier was considered a desirable location because inmates on the top level could hear the guards' footsteps on the metal stairs well before they arrived for checks. Small advantage. The men on that block took it seriously. Monday through Friday, every prisoner worked. Weekends were off unless you had been sent to solitary for breaking a rule. The job assignment process at Alcatraz was controlled by a guard named Maurice Ordway, who had been at the facility longer than any other officer. Ordway told Bulger he would be working in the kitchen. Bulger told Ordway he had heard there were meat cleavers and large knives in the kitchen.
Ordway reconsidered and put Bulger in the prison clothing room instead, handing out uniforms to other inmates. He worked there for nearly a year. The men Bulger shared Alcatraz with during those years were not ordinary prisoners. Mickey Cohen, who had run gambling operations across Los Angeles in the 1940s, was there. Alvin Karpus, who had been on the FBI's most wanted list during the 1930s and served more time at Alcatraz than any other inmate in the prison's history, was there. These were men who had operated at levels Bulger had not yet reached. He was a 30-year-old bank robber from South Boston, learning from people who had built criminal operations that spanned entire cities. The most significant relationship he formed was with Clarence Carnes. Carnes was a Choctaw man from Oklahoma who had been sentenced to life in prison at the age of 16 for a robbery that turned fatal.
He had then participated in a violent two-day uprising at Alcatraz in 1946, the event known as the Battle of Alcatraz, in which 2 prison guards were killed. Carnes had been given an additional 99 years on top of his life sentence, but was not executed because he had pulled back from the uprising before the worst of it. By the time Bulger arrived in 1959, Carnes was a veteran of the island. He knew every guard, every routine, every unwritten rule of the place. Carnes took Bulger under his wing. That friendship lasted for the rest of Carnes's life. When Alcatraz closed in March 1963, shut down by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy because it cost nearly $10 per prisoner per day to run, 3 times more than other federal prisons, and the salt water had structurally damaged the buildings, Bulger was transferred out. He went to Leavenworth in Kansas, then to Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. But what he had absorbed during those years on the island stayed with him permanently. In letters he wrote decades later, after being arrested in 2011 and facing the rest of his life behind bars, Bulger described Alcatraz with open nostalgia. He wrote that it had a great view. He called it pretty good. He said the rules were clear and everyone knew what they were. He described arriving on the boat that brought inmates from the mainland, bolted in for security, and remembered the feeling of the place. He told Alcatraz historian Michael Esslinger, who collected over 1,000 pages of handwritten letters from Bulger during his final years, that if he could choose his own tombstone inscription, it would read, "I'd rather be in Alcatraz, 1428-AZ." He also went back voluntarily. While he was on the run as a federal fugitive in the 1990s and 2000s, one of the most wanted men in the country, with a $2 million reward on his head, Bulger took the tourist ferry to Alcatraz Island and walked through the place as a paying visitor. There is a photograph of this. The most wanted man in America, wandering the corridors of the prison he once loved, while the rest of the country was looking for him. What Carnes got out of the friendship was something more concrete. He died in 1988 at a federal medical facility in Missouri, broke, buried in an unmarked pauper's grave outside the prison grounds. When Bulger found out, he paid to have the body exhumed and moved to Choctaw Land in Oklahoma, Carnes' home territory, and reburied properly.
The Boston Globe and Boston Herald both reported this at the time. It happened. The man who would eventually be convicted of involvement in 11 homicides arranged a proper burial for his dead friend out of what appears to have been straightforward loyalty. That contradiction is going to come up again, because the next chapter is about how Bulger got out, what the government handed him upon release, and how quickly things turned. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing.
It helps the channel tremendously. The door opened in 1965. He walked out with $10, no supervision, and a brain that had been permanently altered by the United States government. What Boston got back was not what it sent away. Section 3. 9 years served, $10 given, 0 supervision. March 1965. The gate at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania opened, and James Bulger walked out. He had gone in with a 20-year sentence. He came out after 9 years. Prison officials handed him $10 and sent him on his way. There was no parole officer waiting. Before he left, officials had quietly decided that Bulger would not be required to report to a parole advisor as a standard condition of release. That supervision requirement, the one thing designed to keep a returning prisoner accountable, had been waived. The man who had spent years being chemically altered by a CIA program, who had served time at 4 different federal institutions, who had been transferred to Alcatraz specifically because authorities suspected he was planning an escape. That man walked back into Boston with $10, no check-ins, and no oversight. How did he get out 9 years early from a 20-year sentence? The answer involves 2 things: political connections and a pattern of behavior Bulger had been developing since his first week behind bars. His family's congressman was John McCormick. McCormick represented South Boston and happened to be a neighbor of the Bulger family. By the time Whitey was working toward his 3rd parole attempt in the mid-1960s, McCormick was not just a congressman. He was Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, one of the most powerful positions in American government. The Bureau of Prisons director had already written back to McCormick years earlier, telling the Speaker directly that he had asked institutional staff to keep Bulger's case in mind. That letter exists. Researchers Dick Lair and Jerry O'Neill obtained documentation of this correspondence and reported it through the Boston Globe and WBUR. Bulger's brother William had also been elected to the Massachusetts State House of Representatives in 1960, while Whitey was still locked up. The Bulger family was building political capital on one track, while Whitey was working every angle available to him on another. His first parole attempt in 1963 was denied. His second was denied. His third, in March 1965, was granted. 9 years into a 20-year sentence, he was free. What happened next was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. Kevin Weeks, who later became Bulger's closest associate and eventually testified against him at trial, described it plainly when asked by journalist David Borey whether he believed there had been more criminal activity immediately after Bulger's release. Weeks said yes. He added that Bulger himself claimed to have committed 19 bank robberies after getting out of prison. That is not a verified criminal record. Bulger was never charged with those specific crimes after his release, and these are his own boastful words relayed through Weeks. But the direction of travel was unmistakable from the moment he walked out. He started as a janitor and construction worker, then quickly moved into bookmaking and loan sharking, with ties to Donald Killeen, who ran the dominant criminal organization in South Boston at the time. The world he returned to was a specific one. South Boston, Southie to everyone who lived there, was an insular Irish Catholic working-class neighborhood where a man's reputation on the street was currency. Bulger had left as a convicted bank robber who had served time at Alcatraz. He came back as someone who had done serious federal time without breaking, without publicly cooperating,
without losing his standing. In a neighborhood that respected toughness above nearly everything else, that history made him something. His younger brother William was already on his way up through Massachusetts politics and would eventually serve as president of the Massachusetts Senate for 18 years, the longest tenure in that state's history. The two brothers were moving in completely opposite directions at the same time, and yet they remained connected to the same community, the same streets, the same web of South Boston loyalty that protected both of them in different ways. Bulger did not immediately climb to the top of anything.
The rise took time. He worked under Killeen. He built relationships. He established himself through the kind of low-level enforcement work that lets people know, gradually and without much spectacle, that you are someone who can be counted on to handle problems. The important thing to understand about this period is what the government had returned to the streets. Not a reformed man who had served his time, not a supervised parolee with regular check-ins. A man whose sleep had been permanently damaged by CIA drug experiments. A man who had spent years studying criminal hierarchy at Alcatraz alongside people who had built empires. A man with political connections reaching all the way to the Speaker of the House. And a man who, in 9 years of watching how the system worked from the inside, had learned that the right relationships, maintained carefully, could get you almost anything. That last lesson would shape everything that came after. By the early 1970s, Killeen was gone. The gang war between his crew and a rival group called the Mullen Gang had turned fatal, and in 1972, Killeen was shot and killed. Bulger shifted his allegiance to the Winter Hill Gang, led by Howie Winter out of Somerville, Massachusetts. He rose quickly within that structure. By the mid-1970s, he was not an enforcer working for someone else. He was running things. And he had found an entirely new kind of relationship to keep him protected, one that would allow him to operate for another 2 decades without any serious interference from law enforcement. That relationship was with the FBI. And what makes it extraordinary is not just that it existed, but what the FBI gave him in exchange for it, and what Bulger did while they were looking the other way. Section 4. The FBI partnership that let him operate. The meeting happened in the fall of 1975 on a beach in Quincy, Massachusetts. John Connolly, an FBI agent who had grown up a few doors down from the Bulger family in South Boston's Old Harbor housing project, sent word that he had something important to say. Bulger later wrote in an unpublished manuscript found by agents after his 2011 arrest that going to that meeting felt uncomfortable. But he went because Connolly was from the neighborhood. They met in Connolly's car. The pitch was straightforward. The FBI wanted intelligence on the Italian Mafia operating in Boston, specifically the Patriarca crime family and their underboss, Gennaro Angiulo. The Mafia was already giving the FBI information about Bulger's gang, Connolly told him. Why not return the favor? Bulger agreed to cooperate, under one condition. He told Connolly he would not be referred to as an informant. He would be called a strategist. That word choice was not accidental. In South Boston, being a person who gave information to law enforcement was the worst thing you could be. Bulger had built his entire reputation on being someone who did not talk. The idea that he was doing it anyway, and had been doing it for nearly 2 decades, was the central irony of his entire criminal career. And the fact that barely anyone believed it while it was happening was something he was openly proud of. His FBI file later included a note from a 1980 meeting in which Bulger told his handlers that nobody would ever believe he was cooperating. It would be, he said, too incredible. He was right for a long time. What followed was a 15-year arrangement that functioned very differently from what the FBI describes when it talks about using criminal informants. The standard framing is that the government uses a criminal to gather intelligence in exchange for limited protection on minor matters, while still pursuing serious charges when they arise. What actually happened in Boston was the opposite.
Bulger and his partner Stephen Flemmi provided information on Italian Mafia targets. In return, they were shielded from prosecution for their own activities, including being deliberately removed from a 1978 race-fixing indictment that should have included both of them. Connolly's supervisor, FBI agent John Morris, admitted under oath at Bulger's 2013 trial that he had personally recommended excluding Bulger and Flemmi from that indictment because of their value as informants. Neither man was charged. The FBI results on the Mafia side were real. Using intelligence from Bulger and Flemmi, Connolly helped build the case that led to the arrest of Gennaro Angiulo in 1983. Angiulo was the head of the Italian Mafia's operations in Boston. That was a legitimate law enforcement achievement. Connolly was praised inside the FBI for it. His career advanced. What his career advancement cost everyone else in Boston is harder to put in a single sentence. While Connolly was being rewarded for results, Bulger was using the protection to operate without the normal risks that come with running a large criminal organization. Anytime someone in the criminal world began providing information to law enforcement about Bulger's activities, Connolly would find out through normal FBI channels and pass the information back to Bulger. That meant the people who talked were not protected. They were exposed. Brian Halloran found this out in the worst possible way. In 1982, Halloran was an associate of the Winter Hill Gang who had begun cooperating with the government. He had information linking Bulger and Flemmi to the 1981 fatal shooting of Roger Wheeler, a businessman who owned World Highlight. FBI Assistant Special Agent Robert Fitzpatrick, who was stationed in Boston at the time, later testified that he had recommended Halloran be placed in witness protection after receiving warnings that word of his cooperation had spread. That request was denied. In May 1982, Halloran was shot and killed outside a fish restaurant near the Boston waterfront. Connolly was later convicted of racketeering and second-degree murder in connection with his corrupt activities protecting the gang, though he maintained throughout that others were more responsible for the specific leak that caused Halloran's death. John Callahan was next. Callahan was a former executive who had connections to both Bulger and World Highlight. The FBI was looking at him as a potential witness to link Bulger to the Wheeler shooting. Stephen Flemmi later testified at Connolly's Florida trial that Connolly had warned both him and Bulger that investigators were looking to question Callahan about the Wheeler case and two other related matters. Acting on that warning, Bulger and Flemmi arranged for Callahan to be lured to Florida. An associate named John Martirano shot him and left the body in the trunk of Callahan's Cadillac at Miami International Airport. That was August 1982. Connolly received more than $235,000 in payments from Bulger and Flemmi over the course of the arrangement. His supervisor Morris admitted at trial to accepting $7,000 in cash and 2 cases of wine. Bulger's own writings, found after his arrest, suggested the amounts paid to Morris were considerably higher, describing the $7,000 figure Morris admitted to as being off by, in Bulger's words, a couple more zeros. FBI agent Robert Fitzpatrick, who had pushed to have Bulger removed as an informant as early as 1981, was overruled by FBI headquarters. Connolly and Morris argued that Bulger and Flemmi were too valuable to the ongoing Angiulo investigation to drop. Headquarters agreed. Fitzpatrick was shut down. The arrangement continued for another decade. By 1994, the entire structure was finally starting to collapse. Federal prosecutors had built a racketeering case against Bulger. The indictment was coming. But before it was formally filed, Connolly, who had by then retired from the FBI, made one more move. He warned Bulger that the arrest was imminent. Bulger left Boston in January 1995 and was not found for 16 years. What happened to Connolly matters here too. He was convicted in 2002 on federal racketeering charges and sentenced to 10 years. Then, separately, a Florida jury convicted him in 2008 of second-degree unlawful taking of a life for his role in the Callahan matter. That sentence was 40 years. He was eventually granted medical release from a Florida facility in 2021 after doctors said he was terminally ill with cancer. The FBI overhauled its informant program rules after everything came out. Some families of people harmed during Bulger's protected years received government compensation, but no full public accounting of exactly how many people inside the FBI knew what was happening or for how long has ever been completed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bulger fled, and the trail he left behind when he disappeared is its own story. One that involves a rent-controlled apartment, 30 guns hidden in the walls, and one of the most absurd fugitive runs in American federal history. Section 5. 16 years, 30 guns, and a stray cat. He left Boston in January 1995 with a head start. Connolly had given him the warning. The indictment was coming. Bulger had reportedly been preparing for this possibility for years, with safety deposit boxes in London, Dublin, Montreal, and Clearwater, Florida, already loaded with cash. He walked away from everything he had built in South Boston and did not look back. The first chapter of his time as a fugitive involved his girlfriend, Teresa Stanley, who had been with him for years. They drove across the country together, stopping in multiple cities. They spent New Year's in New Orleans. They went to Arizona and California. But in 1995, Stanley told him she needed to go home. She could not live without her family in Boston. Bulger drove her to a Chili's parking lot and left her there. He then went and picked up Catherine Gregg, his other long-term partner, and the two of them continued the fugitive life together. Gregg knew exactly who she was with and what she was helping him hide from. She made a choice. She stayed. The couple eventually settled in Santa Monica, California, around 1996. They moved into apartment 303 at the Princess Eugenia building on 1012 3rd Street, a 3-story, 28-unit complex 3 blocks from the Pacific Ocean and 2 blocks from the 3rd Street Promenade, one of the most heavily trafficked tourist areas in Los Angeles. The rent was $1,145 a month under rent control. They paid in cash several days early every month for approximately 15 years. Their names were Charles and Carol Gasco. The identity did not come from nowhere. Bulger had befriended a homeless man named Charlie Gasca in a park near Palisades Park in Santa Monica. The two men were approximately the same age and looked similar. Bulger obtained the man's social security number and built his new identity around it. When Gasca later died, Bulger was driving a car registered in Gasca's name. According to retired FBI agents who worked the case, Bulger abandoned the car and stopped driving entirely after the man's death, rather than risk any confusion around the registration. Inside the apartment, neighbors knew the Gascos as a quiet, polite, older couple. A handwritten sign on their door read, "Please do not knock." They told people Bulger slept during the day. What neighbors did not know was that he sat up at night, peering through binoculars out the window. The windows themselves were blacked out. He did not want light visible from outside after dark. When FBI agents eventually searched the apartment after his arrest, they found $822,000 $198 in cash. The money was wrapped in plastic and hidden inside holes cut into the walls behind drywall. Most of it was in packages of $100 bills. Almost all of those bills had been printed in 1995, the year he left Boston. Bulger was aware the age of the bills was a problem. He told agents after his arrest that he had traveled to Las Vegas multiple times as a fugitive, specifically to solve it. He would bring old cash to the major casinos, convert it to chips, play a few hands of whatever game was nearby, then cash the chips back out for fresh bills. It was not a glamorous operation. It was practical. The weapons count was 30, all found in the walls. The arsenal included handguns, machine guns, sawed-off shotguns, and MAC-10 pistols. The FBI also recovered false Social Security cards and fake driver's licenses. The two of them maintained a routine that made them effectively invisible. Grieg shopped at a 99-cent store. She visited a hair salon regularly. They went to the farmer's market twice a week. On special occasions, like Bulger's 81st birthday in September 2009, they went to Michael's, an upscale restaurant on the other side of Santa Monica. The restaurant manager later confirmed to reporters that he had a record of the couple dining at table 23 that month. They paid $190 in cash for a meal that included Grey Goose vodka cocktails, foie gras, steak, lobster, and wine. One of America's most wanted men ate foie gras on his 81st birthday 2 miles from the ocean and left a cash tip. He also, according to one documented account, went to a movie theater in San Diego in 2006 to watch The Departed, Martin Scorsese's film that was partly based on his own life. An off-duty sheriff's deputy from Boston was in the same theater. They made eye contact as they were leaving. Bulger got on a trolley and disappeared. What ended it was a cat and a television advertisement. The FBI in 2011 launched a new publicity campaign specifically targeting Greg. They had struggled for years to generate leads on Bulger's location and decided to try a different approach, running 30-second ads on daytime television that emphasized Greg's appearance, her love of plastic surgery, and her known fondness for animals. The spots were aimed at women watching daytime TV, not the standard law enforcement audience. Anna Bjornsdottir was Miss Iceland in 1974 and had worked as a model and actress. She had been a part-time neighbor of Bulger and Greg in Santa Monica. She and Greg had developed a casual friendship while both caring for a stray cat that lived near the apartment building. Greg came out every morning to feed it. Bjornsdottir did the same. They talked. In June 2011, Bjornsdottir was back home in Reykjavik, Iceland, watching CNN, when a segment ran featuring the FBI's new advertisement. Greg's face came on the screen. Bjornsdottir recognized her immediately as the woman she had chatted with over the cat in Santa Monica. She contacted the FBI. The call came in on June 21, 2011. 2 days later, agents used a ruse, telling Bulger someone had broken into his storage unit, to bring him outside. He was arrested on June 22, 2011, standing in front of his apartment building. He initially identified himself as Charles Gasco. Then he said, "You know who I am. I'm Whitey Bulger." He cooperated from that point, leading agents to the guns and the cash himself. Bjornsdottir received the $2 million reward. Bulger was 81 years old. He had been on the run for 16 years, number 1 on the FBI's 10 most wanted list after Osama bin Laden was removed. He had been 3 blocks from the beach the entire time. He had been captured. But what came next? The trial, the verdict, and then what the federal prison system did with an 89-year-old man in a wheelchair is a story that goes somewhere much darker than anything that happened in that apartment. Section 6. The trial, the verdict, and the families who finally got to speak. The trial of James Bulger opened on June 12, 2013, in federal court in Boston. He was 83 years old. He had been waiting 2 years since his arrest for the case to reach this point, and even getting to trial had produced its own drama. The original judge assigned to the case, Richard Stearns, was removed before the trial started. Bulger's defense successfully argued that Stearns had previously worked in the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston, which had focused on organized crime, the same division that had pursued Bulger's rivals, while his FBI relationship kept him protected. A federal appeals court agreed the conflict was real and removed him. Judge Denise Casper, the first African-American woman appointed as a federal judge in Massachusetts, took over. Before a single witness testified, Bulger's lawyers tried to have the entire case dismissed. Their argument was that a now-deceased federal prosecutor named Jeremiah O'Sullivan had granted Bulger immunity from prosecution in the 1970s in exchange for his cooperation against the Mafia. If true, it would have meant the government had explicitly agreed to let him operate without being charged. Judge Casper ruled in May 2013 that Bulger could not use this claim at trial because he had not provided hard evidence that such an agreement existed. Bulger, furious, told the judge privately that he felt choked off from giving an adequate defense. He decided not to testify. What followed was 7 weeks of testimony that covered decades of specific, documented criminal activity in almost unbearable detail. The government called 77 witnesses. They included convicted hitmen, former associates, extortion victims, corrupt FBI agents testifying under immunity, and family members of the people Bulger had been charged with killing. The courtroom held killers sitting a few feet from the families of people those killers had helped put in the ground, all describing the same events from different positions. John Martirano, who had confessed to personally taking the lives of 20 people and received a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony, described drive-by attacks carried out as Bulger rose to power. He and Bulger, according to his account, once shot into a car they believed was driven by a specific rival, only to discover afterward they had shot the wrong person entirely, an innocent man named Michael Milano, who had nothing to do with any of it. Stephen Flemmi, Bulger's longtime partner, who was serving a life sentence for 10 confirmed fatalities, took the stand and described the night Deborah Davis was strangled. Davis was Flemmi's 26-year-old girlfriend. According to Flemmi's testimony, she had become upset when he left her birthday party suddenly. He told her why, that he and Bulger had a connection to FBI agent John Connolly, and he had to go. He said he accidentally revealed they were informants. Flemmi testified that he told Bulger what had happened, that he himself could not do what needed to be done, and that Bulger said he would handle it. A female juror covered her mouth and began to cry during the testimony. Others looked away. Kevin Weeks, Bulger's former right-hand man, took the stand and called Bulger and Flemmi the 2 biggest rats he had ever encountered. This said in a courtroom where Bulger was sitting 15 feet away. Weeks had spent years helping bury bodies, according to his own admissions, and had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. When a defense attorney suggested during cross-examination that Weeks had manipulated the system to benefit himself, Weeks told the lawyer he was welcome to step outside. U.S. Marshals stayed alert. Bulger, who had been largely quiet throughout the trial, could not help himself. He hissed at Weeks. The judge had to intervene. A former drug dealer named William Lindholm testified that in 1983, Bulger's crew had summoned him over a money dispute. An associate spun a loaded weapon on a table, pointed it at Lindholm, and pulled the trigger. The weapon did not go off. Then the associate fired it at the wall to prove it was loaded. Lindholm testified that he was simply glad to get out of there. On August 12, 2013, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on 31 of 32 counts. Found to have participated in 11 of the 19 cases presented. The jury concluded the government had not proved his involvement in 7 other cases and could not reach a decision on 1. 2 life sentences plus 5 years was what prosecutors asked for.
It was what he received on November 14, 2013, at a sentencing hearing that lasted 2 days. Before the sentence was handed down, the families of the people he had been convicted of harming were allowed to speak. Judge Casper extended this to include families of victims in cases where the jury had not returned a conviction, meaning relatives of all 19 people could address the court if they chose to. Sean McGonigal, whose father Paul was shot in 1974, was 11 years old when his father disappeared. He told the court that in 1975, someone had called their house and told them his father was not coming home for Christmas. When young Sean asked who was calling, the voice said, "This is Santa Claus." The voice, McGonigal said, was Bulger's. He called Bulger Satan and said the electric chair would be too good for him.
Stephen Davis, whose sister Deborah had been strangled, told Bulger he hoped he died the same way she did, gasping for breath. Teresa Bond, whose father, Arthur Barrett, had been shot at close range by Bulger, according to trial testimony, faced Bulger directly and said, "I just want you to know that I don't hate you." Bulger sat through all of it without a word. He wore an orange jumpsuit. He showed no reaction. When the judge asked if he wanted to speak before sentence was passed, he remained silent. Judge Casper sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. She ordered him to pay $19.5 million in restitution to victims' families and to forfeit $25.2 million to the government. She told him that he had, over time, become a face of the city of Boston and that this was regrettable. He was 84 years old. He had no possibility of release. The government had gotten its conviction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What nobody in that courtroom fully understood yet was that the story was not over, because the federal prison system was about to make a series of decisions about where to put a frail, elderly man that would produce a final chapter nobody could have scripted. Section 7. The Last Prison, the Downgrade, and the 8 months alone. After sentencing in November 2013, Bulger moved through the federal prison system the way most high-profile inmates do, quietly at first, then with increasing difficulty as his health began to fall apart. He landed at USP Coleman II in Sumterville, Florida in 2014. Coleman II was a specific kind of federal penitentiary. It was known inside the system as a reasonably safe place for people with targets on their backs: informants, gang dropouts, former law enforcement. The population there understood that the people around them had complicated histories, and the culture was less volatile than at other high-security federal facilities. For a man who had spent decades as a secret FBI cooperator and was now serving life for 11 deaths, Coleman was the closest thing to a sensible placement. He was old, getting older fast, and the letters he sent from inside, Coleman paint a specific picture of what those years looked like. He wrote to Candace Lind, the daughter of a former Alcatraz guard, starting in 2014. He wrote to Charlie Hopkins, a Florida man who had also served time at Alcatraz decades earlier. He wrote to other correspondents, including, eventually, one of the jurors from his own trial. The letters went out in the early hours of the morning, 1, 2, 3 in the morning, because sleep had never fully returned to him since the CIA drug experiments in Atlanta in the late 1950s. Nightmares still pulled him awake every hour or so. He wrote to fill the time. By his own account in those letters, he had suffered 8 heart attacks. He took nitroglycerin tablets for chest pain. He used oxygen. He described chest pain when he ate, chest pain when he lay down, constant fatigue, and memory problems that were getting worse. In one letter from February 2018, he wrote, "Don't worry about me. I'm too mean to die." He wanted to live long enough to see Catherine Gregg when she got out of prison in 2020. That was the goal he kept returning to in letter after letter. Then, in February 2018, something happened that set off the chain of events that ended his life. A nursing supervisor at Coleman came to see him about his chest pains and pressed him to go to an outside hospital to see a heart specialist. Bulger refused. The confrontation escalated. According to prison records obtained by NBC News and the Boston Globe, Bulger told the nurse, "Your day of reckoning is coming."
The retired warden who spoke to NBC News confirmed the threat. Prison staff were alarmed, not because Bulger had the physical capacity to harm anyone, but because of who he had been and who he might still have connections to. He was placed in solitary confinement. His version of events, recorded in prison records later obtained by the New York Times, was different. He said prison workers had started arguing with him, which triggered a cardiac episode. He told his case manager, "She gave me a heart attack due to yelling at me. It was all blown out of proportion. I didn't threaten her." What is not disputed is what came next. He was originally given 30 days in the Special Housing Unit, the formal name for solitary. Those 30 days stretched to 60, then more, then more. He remained in isolation for 8 months straight. 8 months alone in a cell at 88 years old, with a serious heart condition, no meaningful human contact, and nightmares that had been waking him up every hour for 60 years. In April 2018, officials at Coleman submitted a formal request to transfer him to a federal medical center, the appropriate facility for someone with his condition and care level. That request was denied by the Bureau of Prisons. The reasoning was not made fully public. By September 27, 2018, after nearly 7 months alone, Bulger met with a case manager. What he said was recorded in a suicide risk assessment report and later cited word for word in the Department of Justice Inspector General's findings. He said, "I have no quality of life. My health is gone. I get chest pains when I eat, chest pains when I lay down. I feel lethargic all the time. I have memory problems. I'm deteriorating." 10 days after saying that, a transfer to a different facility was approved, not a medical center. A transfer to USP Hazleton in West Virginia. Here is what made that decision remarkable. Coleman's staff had spent months trying to get Bulger into a medical facility because his heart condition required a Care Level 3 classification, the designation that kept him at Coleman and similar facilities with higher medical capacity. To send him to Hazleton, which was a Care Level 2 facility, his medical classification had to be downgraded. Bureau of Prisons records show that a senior Coleman official recommended the downgrade. Another high-ranking official had previously denied a downgrade request, noting explicitly that his heart condition required higher-level care. This time, the downgrade went through. The Bureau of Prisons medical director's own guidance, based on Bulger's records, was set aside. His cardiac issues were officially reclassified as anxiety-induced rather than a genuine cardiac condition. He was 89 years old. He used a wheelchair. He had just spent 8 months alone, telling anyone who would listen that he was deteriorating. And on October 29, 2018, he was loaded onto a transport and sent to a prison that a Bureau of Prisons employee would later describe to investigators as a dangerous place altogether. Internal emails about the transfer went out to prison staff in mid-October. Over 100 Bureau of Prisons employees knew he was coming before he arrived. Staff at Hazleton reportedly spoke openly about it near inmates, in direct violation of Bureau of Prisons policy. The news spread through the facility. Inmates started talking about it. Some placed bets on how long he would survive. One of those inmates was a Mafia enforcer from Massachusetts. His name was Fotios Geese, and he had very specific feelings about people who cooperate with the government.
What happened in the hours after Bulger arrived at Hazleton is the next section, and it is the part of this story that the DOJ's own watchdog called deeply troubling.
Section 8. 12 Hours at Hazleton. Bulger arrived at USP Hazleton in Brewston Mills, West Virginia at 8:30 p.m. on October 29, 2018. He was 89 years old, in a wheelchair, and carrying a heart condition that the Bureau of Prisons had just officially reclassified as no longer serious enough to require a medical facility. The prison was already waiting for him. At 3:30 that same afternoon, 5 hours before he arrived, an inmate named Sean McKinnon had called his mother on a recorded prison phone line. McKinnon told her that the facility was getting ready to receive a higher-profile person. When his mother asked who it was, he told her it was Whitey Bulger. She told him to stay away. He told her he could not. His mother replied, "You get in trouble." McKinnon told her, "I don't plan it." That call was later obtained by federal prosecutors and read aloud in court. The news of Bulger's transfer had been circulating inside Hazleton for weeks. Over 100 Bureau of Prisons employees had received internal emails about the incoming transfer. Staff had spoken openly about it near inmates, in direct violation of policy. The facility had seen 2 inmate fatalities in the 6 months before Bulger arrived, and other inmates in Bulger's assigned housing unit were from the Genovese crime family in New England, the same organized crime structure that Bulger had spent years helping the FBI dismantle as an informant. Inmates were placing bets on how long he would survive. This was not rumor. It was documented in the DOJ Inspector General's report, based on direct statements from prisoners at the facility who described it to investigators after the fact. When Bulger went through intake processing that night, he said to the official handling his paperwork, "Don't believe everything you see." He was referring to the films about his life, The Departed and Black Mass. He always denied being an informant, right until the end. Then he asked to be placed in general population rather than protective housing. The DOJ Inspector General's report noted that his long stint in solitary confinement at Coleman had likely contributed to that request. 8 months alone had made him willing to accept any risk to be around other people again. He was placed in a cell in the general population at 9:53 p.m. At 6:16 a.m. the following morning, his cellmate left the cell after the morning lockdown was lifted, and the block was unlocked for inmates to move toward the dining hall for breakfast. Security footage from the facility showed 2 inmates wheeling Bulger's wheelchair into a corner of the cell, out of the camera's view. According to prosecutors and court documents, Fotios Gaius and Paul de Colagero then entered and struck Bulger in the head multiple times with a lock stuffed inside a sock. The attack lasted approximately 7 minutes, according to federal prosecutors who cited evidence at a later court hearing. Prison staff did not discover what had happened until 8:07 a.m., roughly 2 hours after the attack began. He was pronounced dead at 9:04 a.m. His official cause of death, listed on the death certificate, was blunt force injuries to the head. Fotios Gaius was 51 years old and already serving multiple life sentences. He was from the Springfield, Massachusetts area and had worked as an enforcer connected to the Genovese crime family, though as a man of Greek descent, he was not eligible to become a formally made member of the Italian Mafia. He had been convicted in 2011 for his role in multiple violent crimes, including the 2003 shooting of Adolfo Bruno, the Genovese family boss in Springfield, in a parking lot. The man who ordered the Bruno hit later became an FBI cooperator and testified against Gaius. That betrayal was something Gaius never forgave or forgot. Private investigator Ted McDonough, who had known Gaius personally, gave a direct explanation to the Boston Globe in the days after Bulger's death. He said, "Freddie hated people who cooperate with authorities. Freddie hated men who harmed women. Whitey was someone who cooperated with authorities and also took the lives of women. It's probably that simple."
Paul DeCologero, the second man charged, was from Lowell, Massachusetts, and was serving a sentence connected to a gang conspiracy in which a 19-year-old woman was given a fatal dose of heroin when the gang feared she would talk. When the dose did not finish the job, another gang member broke her neck and buried her in the woods. Sean McKinnon, the third person charged, was Geisha's cellmate and was accused of acting as a lookout while the attack took place. All three eventually entered plea agreements with federal prosecutors in 2024. The case against Geish and DeCologero reached resolution without a trial.
Bulger's family filed a $200 million wrongful death lawsuit against the federal government, arguing that authorities had deliberately placed him in danger. A judge dismissed that lawsuit. The DOJ Inspector General's nearly 70-page report, released in December 2022, concluded there was no evidence that Bureau of Prisons employees acted with malicious intent. What it found instead was a chain of failures so long and so compounding that the outcome became, in the report's framing, essentially inevitable. Bureaucratic incompetence, policy violations, disregarded medical guidance, and an institutional culture that treated the transfer of one of the country's most recognizable federal prisoners as casually as a routine administrative task. The man who had survived Atlanta, Alcatraz, a CIA drug program, 16 years as a fugitive, and a 2-month federal trial, was taken out in the early morning hours of October 30th, 2018, in a West Virginia prison where the inmates had been betting on his arrival date for weeks. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What his story leaves behind, for the FBI, for the federal prison system, and for every person who was harmed while the government looked the other way, is the subject of the next section. Section 9. What was left behind? When Bulger's story finally ended on October 30th, 2018, it left behind a trail that went well past one man's life of crime. The damage spread across institutions, across families, and across decades, and some of it is still being sorted through today. Start with the 4 men who had nothing to do with any of it. Peter Limon, Joseph Salvati, Henry Temelio, and Louis Greco were convicted in 1968 for the 1965 shooting of a man named Edward Deegan. They did not do it. The FBI knew they did not do it. The actual shooter was a man named Joseph Barboza, who was himself an FBI informant. Barboza lied on the stand and named the 4 men as killers, and FBI agents in Boston, whose priority at the time was protecting their informant network at any cost, withheld evidence of their innocence from state prosecutors. 3 of the 4 men were sentenced to be put to death. Those sentences were later changed to life in prison. 2 of them died behind bars before the truth surfaced. The FBI memos proving they had been framed only became public during a Justice Department investigation into the Boston field office's relationship with Bulger and Flemmi. In 2001, Limon and Salvati were exonerated. In 2007, a federal judge ordered the government to pay more than $101 million to the 4 men and the families of the 2 who had died in prison. The judge called the government's defense that it bore no responsibility for a state prosecution, which it had actively manipulated, absurd. "No lost liberty is dispensable," she said. "We have fought wars over this principle." That $101 million judgment came directly from the same investigative threads that started with Bulger and Flemmi being used as informants. The protection of that informant network, run by Connolly and Morris, had produced not just the cover for Bulger's crimes, but the active corruption of a murder trial that put innocent men behind bars for decades. Separately, 3 families of Bulger victims, including the family of Deborah Davis, one of the women he strangled, sued the government for wrongful death, arguing that the FBI and Justice Department had caused their loved ones' deaths by shielding Bulger and Flemmi as informants. They won. The government paid. On the policy side, the Bulger scandal forced real changes to how the FBI manages criminal informants, though how thoroughly those changes took hold is still debated. Attorney General Janet Reno introduced stricter disclosure requirements in the 1990s after the first details emerged, requiring FBI agents to report to the Justice Department when an informant engaged in illegal activity, especially violence. The 2005 DOJ Inspector General report found the FBI was still not fully following its own updated guidelines in 87% of the cases reviewed. In 2011, a Massachusetts congressman named Stephen Lynch proposed legislation requiring federal agencies to report annually on the crimes committed by their informants. The bill was rooted explicitly in what the Bulger case had exposed. The House Government Reform Committee titled its formal investigation report, "Everything Secret Degenerates: The FBI's Use of Murderers as Informants." That report, entered into the congressional record, documented how FBI agents in Boston had protected Bulger and Flemmi while they committed serious crimes, and concluded that the Bureau needed to fundamentally improve how it managed its informant relationships and held agents accountable. Then there is the question nobody has fully answered. How many people inside the FBI knew what was happening in Boston, and for how long? Connolly took the fall formally. Morris cooperated with prosecutors and received immunity in exchange for his testimony. But former Massachusetts State Police Commander Tom Foley, who spent years pursuing Bulger while the FBI was protecting him, said it clearly. Connolly took the hit. Other FBI supervisors in Boston and in Washington were aware of the arrangement and did nothing. No one other than Connolly was ever criminally charged. Richard Lear, who co-authored the book Black Mass about the Bulger-FBI relationship, alongside former Boston Globe colleague Gerard O'Neill, described it as a culture rather than one man's failure. The corruption, he said, had already existed in the Boston field office before Connolly arrived. The incentive structure rewarded agents who developed high-level informants. The oversight that should have caught what Connolly was doing was either absent or deliberately avoided. And then there is Janet Uhler, juror number 12 at Bulger's 2013 trial. After the conviction, Bulger began writing to her. Over the following years, he sent more than 70 letters, many in the early hours of the morning, because sleep still would not come. He described the CIA drug experiments at Atlanta, the LSD doses, the questions about whether he had ever taken a life, the nightmares that never stopped. He told her he was writing between 1 and 3 in the morning because the hallucinations still came when he fell into deep sleep 60 years after the experiments ended. Uhler researched everything he told her. She reviewed the 1977 Senate Intelligence Committee hearings on MK Ultra, where CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified that the agency had been searching for a drug that could prepare a person for, in Turner's words, debilitating an individual or even ending someone's life. She read the book Poisoner in Chief by Brown University professor Stephen Kinzer, which documented how the program's director, Sidney Gottlieb, had left behind, in Kinzer's words, a trail of broken bodies and shattered minds across 3 continents. Her conclusion, stated publicly and on the record, was that the MK Ultra evidence should have been presented at trial. Bulger had not taken anyone's life before the experiments. The CIA had dosed him more than 50 times, repeatedly asked him whether he would be willing to take a life, and released him back into society. She said, "Had I known, I would have absolutely held off on the murder charges." That question, whether the government's own program played a role in producing the man who committed 11 confirmed fatalities, has never been answered in any court. The MK Ultra evidence was not introduced at Bulger's trial. His lawyers never used it. The connection between what happened in Atlanta in 1957 and what happened in South Boston over the following decades remains documented, factually established, and legally unresolved. What all of this adds up to: the wrongfully imprisoned men, the murdered witnesses, the corrupted agents, the families who got checks decades late, and the juror who now regrets her verdict, is the subject of the final section. Section 10. Worse than the movies. Goodfellas ends with Henry Hill in witness protection, eating egg noodles and ketchup instead of shrimp with lobster sauce, mourning the life he used to have. The Departed ends with bodies and a state cop finally getting the truth out into the open. Black Mass ends with Bulger being led away in handcuffs at 81 years old. None of those endings capture what actually happened. The real story is longer, stranger, and built on layers of government involvement that no screenwriter would have been allowed to invent without someone calling it implausible. A CIA drug program that dosed a young man with LSD over 50 times and asked him whether he would be willing to take a life. An FBI partnership that shielded him while he took those lives. A federal prison system that announced his arrival to a compound full of people who had every reason to want him gone, then put a frail 89-year-old man in a wheelchair into general population and walked away. A juror who helped convict him of 11 counts of involvement in fatal acts, who now publicly says she would have voted differently if she had known what the government did to his brain before he ever hurt anyone. That is not a crime story. That is a story about what happens when institutions protect themselves instead of the people they are supposed to serve, and what it costs everyone else. The people it cost most directly were not Bulger's associates or his rivals. They were ordinary people who got pulled into his orbit without choosing to be there. Michael Donahue was driving a friend home from a restaurant in South Boston on May 11, 1982, when that friend, Brian Halloran, who had been cooperating with the government and was supposed to be protected, was targeted. Donahue had nothing to do with any of it. He was a 32-year-old dock worker with 3 sons. He was shot and killed in the car. His son Tommy later spoke at Bulger's sentencing hearing and described growing up without a father, visiting the spot on the waterfront where it happened, and feeling robbed of something that could never be recovered. Deborah Hussey was 26 years old when she was strangled. She was Stephen Flemy's stepdaughter. She had learned that Flemmy and Bulger were FBI informants, and that information got her killed. Her brother Stephen told the court at sentencing that he hoped Bulger would die the same way she did, gasping. Richard Costucci was a bookie who had been passing information to the FBI about the location of some Winter Hill gang members. Bulger found out because Connolly told him. Costucci was found shot in the back of his own car in December 1976, wrapped in a sleeping bag. These are 3 of the 11 cases the jury confirmed. There were 8 more, and behind every single one of them was the same structure. The FBI knowing what Bulger was doing, the FBI protecting him anyway, and the FBI's informant network being treated as more valuable than the people dying around it. The House of Representatives formally titled their investigation into this arrangement, "Everything's Secret Degenerates." That phrase came from a letter written by a Civil War general named Henry Halleck, who used it to describe what happens inside any institution when it operates without accountability. The committee chose it deliberately. The full quote is, "Everything's secret degenerates. Nothing is safe that does not show how it can bear discussion and publicity." Nothing about how the FBI ran its Boston informant program in the 1970s and 1980s could bear that discussion. When the light finally came in, through court cases, through investigative journalism, through the 2013 trial, what it revealed was not one rogue agent, but a culture that had built around protecting its sources at the expense of its mission. Bulger himself understood what his story was. He wrote about it from prison for the last 5 years of his life,
to jurors, to historians, to strangers who had served time at Alcatraz alongside him decades earlier. He wrote in the middle of the night because sleep would not come. He described hallucinations that had been running since 1957. He wrote about wanting to stay alive long enough to see Catherine Gregg when she got out.
He described himself, in one manuscript found after his arrest, as a criminal almost all of his life. He was right about that. He was also someone the government had experimented on, protected, warned, and ultimately failed to keep alive in its own custody. The man died at 89 years old in a wheelchair, in a prison where staff were talking about his arrival like it was a football game, while other inmates placed bets on how long he had left. The movies gave him mythology. The actual record gave him something stranger and harder to sit with, a life that kept intersecting with the government that was supposed to oppose him at every stage, from the first federal penitentiary to the last one. That is the real story. It was always worse than Goodfellas. It just took longer to see all of it clearly. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.